Allow me to introduce the Youth Resilience Unit members that you'll hear from today. I am Dr. Caitlin Aspinall, the Research Program Manager. After the talks, but before we get to the Q&A, our Global Health Research Fellow, Dr. Francois van Logrenberg, will describe one of our projects and how you can lend your expertise. The first speaker today is Professor Jennifer Lau, who was appointed the co-director of the Youth Resilience Unit in July of last year. Previously, she's studied how genetic and environmental factors interact to influence adolescent anxiety and mood problems, emotional processing in youth anxiety and depression, and cognitive precursors of fear and avoidance in adolescents with chronic pain. She's also created a program of research developing early cognitive science-based intervention for mood and anxiety problems, working with schools and other community-based groups, such as arts organizations and social action groups worldwide. Our second speaker is Professor Dennis Ougrin, who was appointed co-director of the unit in September of last year. He is a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist who leads a program of global mental health studies aimed at developing community mental health services in Ukraine and other low and middle income countries. He's also the author of Therapeutic Assessment, a novel model of assessment for young people with self-harm, and has developed and tested an intensive community care service model for young people with severe psychiatric disorders, called Supported Discharge Service. Professor Ougrin's research has informed treatment choices in young people with many kinds of emotional disorders. So with that, I will let you get started, Jennifer.
Hello everyone. I wanted to join Caitlin in welcoming you back to our second workshop. So we asked you at the end of the first workshop what topics you would like to hear about, and school refusal came out in many of the responses, probably because it's become a much more salient concern over the last few years with the pandemic and the lockdown restrictions. So just to give you an overview, although many of you will probably be familiar with these terms of what school refusal is first, I will then pass on after that to Professor Ougrin to talk more about how teachers specifically can offer support to their pupils. So I suppose school refusal has often been considered under the kind of umbrella set of concerns around frequent school absenteeism. So that in and of itself is an educational problem, but actually it's far broader than that because of the short and long-term consequences on health for individuals, families, but also for the broader society in terms of the economic burden. It has become a public health concern as well. So school refusal is usually a set of behaviours that might be reflective of more underlying emotional problems. So sometimes referred to as school phobia in the past or school anxiety, but basically a fear of going to school. It reflects a more kind of internalizing emotional type difficulty. And in the past, it's also been confused or used synonymously with truancy, which is a more kind of reflection of perhaps underlying conduct problems. And Dennis will go into this in a lot more detail in his part of the talk. But I found this kind of really helpful table here to kind of show the kind of different sets of behaviors that are involved in both, and how even though both are associated with school absenteeism, actually the underlying kind of sets of behaviours or causes, if you like, are really quite different. So school refusal, as I said before, is linked with kind of emotional distress around attending school. So these can include anxiety, depression, somatic complaints, and sometimes temper tantrums too, so anger outbursts. So parents are usually aware of the absence and sometimes may even be involved in reinforcing some of the refusal behaviours too. So children will often try to persuade parents of the reasons for keeping them at home. Unlike truancy, which we'll go through in a moment, there's an absence of these kind of antisocial behaviours or conduct type problems. So children usually want to stay at home because it's considered safe and secure, and that's why it's not particularly surprising that sometimes there are instances of separation anxiety within school refusal as well. And there's no problem around doing schoolwork or completing this work even at home. And that contrasts to truancy, where there's a lack of kind of these emotional difficulties. Children often try to conceal the absence of going to school from their parents, and it's associated with these more kind of antisocial acts, so delinquent and disruptive acts. Doesn't want to stay at home, and unwilling to conform to academic expectations. So the other thing to say, I think, is that sometimes absenteeism could be associated with a chronic illness or a chronic health condition, which in and of itself may not be emotional, but sometimes the kind of management of these conditions, the kind of route to rehabilitation, can involve kind of emotional factors, which then reinforces some of these kinds of fears and avoidance around going to school. So these are some statistics that I pulled off the Department for Education website. So many of you may be more familiar with these statistics than me, but you can see that before the pandemic, in terms of persistent absenteeism, this kind of number sat just over 10%, and in recent years with the pandemic and lockdown restrictions has increased to 13%. And so this just gives you an indication of the scope and scale of the problem. These are some factors that have been associated with chronic absenteeism at school. So some of the things we talked about before, so chronic illnesses, but also disability or special education, history of frequent absences before, and also some kind of more other factors that might be more linked to this kind of emotional side of school refusal within absenteeism. So bullying, exposure to violence more generally. So school refusal specifically, so estimates place this between 1% to 5% of school-age children have school refusal, with similar rates between boys and girls, and it seems to be more common at certain developmental junctures, so 5, 6, 10, and 11, which may kind of coincide with the sort of starting of year 1, and also the end of primary school, and that beginning to think about that transition into secondary school. It's linked to or co-occurs with a number of other psychiatric conditions, either in the short term, but also in the long term too. So separation anxiety, I mentioned a little bit earlier, a kind of child onset type of anxiety problem, and then a number of other kind of anxiety subtypes, so social anxiety, social phobia, simple phobia, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, although this is no longer thought of as an anxiety disorder within the diagnostic systems, and then depression type disorders too. So with that very kind of brief overview or introduction of school refusal, I will stop sharing my screen and pass on to my colleague, Dennis.
Thanks, Jennifer, for this wonderful overview. In fact, it's so good you mentioned a few disorders that may underline school refusal. I will just come back to this and have a little poll and see what people think, which ones are actually the most common ones. But before I do that, let me just show you a few slides first. And I know I'm supposed to do share sound. Caitlin taught me that behavior before. All right, so let me see if I can share this thing. Yep. So I assume you can see this. Is that right, Caitlin?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Good. All right. Let me take you from South London, where I am, briefly. It was working just a minute ago. I hope it still does. Ooh. That's interesting. Hold on a sec. Let me try again. Ooh, Caitlin or anybody could, I don't know what's happening here. But this thing which was working just a minute ago doesn't work anymore.
I'm not sure.
Anyway. All right. Let's see. Let's look at this. Oh, there you go. This one at least works. Good. So let me take you a minute to North Tanzania, believe it or not, and have a look at these kids who are playing very nicely.
What's this game? What's this game?
And have a look at this boy here. Can you see him here in blue top? In blue top and like in military trousers. These are hunter-gatherers, people who live basically the sort of lifestyle we've always done until very recently. And you can see that other children are playing very nicely and happily, and he is observing, a little bit frozen. Now, this is exactly the kind of young person who would be school refusing in the UK. And specifically, in his case, this is to do with having quite significant social fears of interacting with other kids. Now, a minute ago, Jennifer told all of us that really school refusal is most commonly to do with anxiety disorders and sometimes depressive disorders in kids. Could anybody tell me which anxiety disorder is most common in kids with school refusal? Just in chat. Any ideas would be good. And I'll see if you also paid attention to what disorders there were. Social anxiety, social, a lot of social anxiety, separation, social separation. All right, interesting, separation anxiety. Generalized, all right, good, thanks. Interesting that not everybody's mentioning the second most common. So indeed, the most common disorder in kids with anxiety, with school refusal is indeed separation anxiety disorder, but in small ones, the ones that Jennifer was saying are like 5 or 6 when they start school. In older teenagers, interestingly, it's actually panic disorder with agoraphobia. That's the most common one. But you're right that all of the other disorders you've mentioned, OCD, social phobia especially, actually the third most common is there. And the thing to say about anxiety, just to remind you that essentially in anxiety disorders, what we see is that there is a significant effect of 2 things. One is called cognitive behavior therapy. I'm sure everybody here knows about that. And the second thing here is medication called SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. By far, the most common treatment for kids with school refusal is actually CBT. Now, what's worth remembering, though, is for all anxiety disorders that exist, if you look at them globally, then the response to medication and CBT is roughly equal, about 60%. But if you give a combination, it gives you about an 80% response. And we know this from a very large study in the States by Walkup and his colleagues. Of course, CBT doesn't give you side effects like SSRIs do. So I will spend the rest of this talk really talking about treatment of school refusal, and especially about CBT, and especially about the types of interventions that are most commonly used in, and that include then teachers in this. CBT, you will know, is basically an approach which links the way the child thinks, their physiology, their emotions, and their behaviors together. And if you change one of these things, the rest will change. That's the theory of CBT. And especially with younger children, we focus a lot more on behavior, and with older kids, a bit more on cognitions, on their thoughts. I will talk a lot more about the three components of CBT, which I really wanted you to learn a little bit more about. And the first one is education, or in the past we used to call it psychoeducation, but I think that psycho bit doesn't fit anymore with a lot of kids, so we don't really say that anymore. And education is sort of more information sharing, I'd say. Now again, psychoeducation has lots of components to it, but the types of things that are important for teachers, I think especially, number one, in my view, is really sharing with families that school refusal, especially the chronic long-term school refusal, is not going to improve by itself. I think that's something that most families don't realize. And sometimes they think that, one day the kid will wake up in the morning and will say, okay, I'm off to school. It's not going to happen. It happens very, very rarely. And I really cannot remember any case where this would happen without any major event prompting this. Then I think teachers often have a very good way to explain fight, flight, or freeze. That's something that I think I always admire how teachers do this. You have to teach about physiology and nervous systems. And I have a very primitive way. I just say, look, we have these wonderful bodies that we have. Some have a bit more wonderful than others, but we have them. And then we have this nervous system, these nerves inside the bodies. And in the past, when we were living in North Tanzania in the savannah, then this nervous system was a wonderful thing. You would walk and then you would hear a noise. You would immediately check out what it actually was. And then if it was an animal like a leopard or some other predatory animal, you would run. You would run, and if it was something different, you might fight. And sometimes you would have to freeze, because then the animal will think you're dead, and they are not going to eat a dead body. But now we don't live in North Tanzania anymore. We live in Newham and Tower Hamlets, and in East London. That's where we live. And the thing is that Mrs. Jones, who is your teacher at primary school, is nothing like a leopard or a hyena at all. She behaves and looks very differently, but yet our systems are still wired to perceive any threat as really something that is going to destroy us. I'm sure you have all kinds of interesting and fancy ways to explaining it, but I think teachers really are very good at this. And then I guess the final thing that I think is really very useful from teachers to share with families is that treatment actually works. And I'm sure most of you know about young people who had really bad school refusal, and then with the right help with the treatment, they improved. And that's something that really a lot of families need to hear, some sort of a hopeful message to it. And the second part I wanted to talk to you about is about the functional school refusal. That's by far the most difficult part of this talk. And I need you to just focus for a minute on that. So school refusal is a little bit complex. And as Jennifer was saying, it has different components to this. But really what drives school refusal is one of these four things. One of them is negative. So two of them are negative and two of them are positive. And two of them are interpersonal and two of them are intrapersonal. So the most common function and driver of school refusal is negative intrapersonal. So this one here, reinforcement. That is, an example of this would be me going out now without a coat, getting really cold, coming back, getting the coat on, and going out and saying, ah, this coat has removed a negative state, which is me being cold. And therefore, this is going to reinforce my wearing coat. For a child with school refusal, a very, very common function of school refusal is to get away from some sort of a negative intrapersonal state. So this is the child who is scared of lifts, scared of a school bus, scared of a number of things that happen outside that are intrapersonal. And perhaps the second most common function in school refusal is also negative reinforcement, but interpersonal. And those are the children who are scared of social interactions, and by avoiding them, they feel better. These are the kids with social phobia, for example. Now, the positive interpersonal and positive intrapersonal reasons are a little bit less common, but they could also play an important role, and it's important to determine this. So positive intrapersonal would be something that happens as a result of not going to school, which is good for the child. A typical example here would be playing computer games, interacting with other kids around the world who are not asleep and not at school, and all of these tangible rewards. And positive interpersonal would be things like getting a lot of quality time with family members, grandmothers, parents, going out shopping and this kind of thing. And so really all school refusal will fit somewhere on this continuum of positive and negative, interpersonal, intrapersonal. This is, if you could follow this, thank you. It's a little bit complex. But we will reinforce this in a minute, because I think that's a really important thing for you to understand about school refusal. So could you kindly look at the top of the chat, and there you will find a scale which is free. And if you click on it, I'd like you to do the following. You'll have about 5 minutes. Please, could you think about a child or a family who school refuses, either somebody from your class or from your family or from your neighborhood. And you will not necessarily know all of the answers, but try to fill this form, bearing in mind this child. And then I'll tell you how to calculate and what function it actually plays. Let me see. So where's the form? Right at the very top. If you scroll up to the very top of the chat, that was the first thing I put there. Is there anybody else who is struggling to find the scale?
Can't see it.
I've just re-added it. If you can see.
All right. Let me put it here. Hold on. I'll do it again. All right, it's here now. It's a PDF. Right, let's just have 4 minutes now, sorry, because we are short for time. Just do your best filling it quickly. 24 items, shouldn't take too long. Ooh, right, so some people still can't see it. All right, what I'm going to do is this. Caitlin, are you still there?
Yes.
I'm going to email, because obviously not everybody can, some people can and some people can't open it. I'll email it to you. And would you mind emailing this to all participants? Do you know their email addresses or not?
I'd have to email it to everyone who registered, and that would take a few minutes. I think it would be.
Fine, let's do that so that people at least have it. But for those of you who can actually access it, please do it now. And then we'll have a little discussion about this.
I've got the scale, Dennis. If you,
you have the scale. Oh, cool.
Go ahead.
Good. Oh, you want to see the question? All right, I'll do that. That's a good idea. You'll have the scale from Caitlin, but I will share the screen now so you can see it. I'll show it to you now. That's the scale. You obviously put the child's name and the date, and then it takes you through questions. How often does your child have bad feelings about going to school? Because he or she is afraid of something related to school. For example, tests, school bus, teachers, fire alarms. Then you say never, that's a 0. Always, that's a 6. Half of the time, 3, and anything in between. So for those of you who can't open the PDF in the chat, do have a look at this and maybe take some notes on the piece of paper, if people still have pieces of paper these days. I'll scroll down. I'll do it one page a minute. So forgive me if you're unable to fill it. You'll get it through email anyway. That's the last page. All right, look, so if you were to score the scale, you can see that basically you put the score for each individual item, so 1, 5, 9, 13, 17, 21, and then you know, 4 other columns, 2, 6, and so on, 3, 7, 4, 8. Then you will have a score, or you could even do a mean score for each of these items. And what they will give you is they will give you an understanding which one of the 4 key functions is the most important, most prominent. If we did a little survey of your answers, we would almost certainly get function 1 here, which is really to do with avoidance of negative affectivity, and function 2, which is escape from aversive social interactions, a lot more commonly scored than the other 2. But it's nonetheless important to have a view of all 4 components. So let's let's just move back to where we are. By the way, the interpersonal positive reinforcement used to be called attention seeking, but I would not recommend to use that word anymore. That's a really derogatory word, and kids really don't like it, and it really doesn't reflect very much. So in terms of then what next, the third and last part of this presentation is about one component of treatment, which is exposure. That's the key thing that most teachers will, well, at least we will try to engage you with that in all cases. So exposure is the idea that what drives anxiety over time is this. You enter into the anxiety-provoking situation, like school. Then, when you feel a lot of anxiety, you run away or you do something to stop feeling anxious. The anxiety then goes down until the next time when you enter the same situation, which again repeats itself. And so the child and the family will go through these waves for as long as they don't have any treatment. And exposure does the opposite of this. So instead of running away, reducing anxiety in some artificial way, you stay there until the anxiety goes down naturally. And you can see on the right-hand side, what actually happens is every time you do exposure, the anxiety will go down. And eventually it will be very limited or absent. And that's when you move to the next stage of exposure. I'll show you an example of exposure here. Hope it works.
Today, where do you think we're going to start?
In the elevator.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? What's your anxiety from 0 to 10?
Like 10.
For Siddhartha, like some other agoraphobics, elevators feel like vertical tombs. She hasn't used one in years.
Ready?
She'll take the stairs or nothing at all.
You can do it.
But not today.
Okay. It's okay. Just step in.
As it turns out, getting in is the easy part.
What's your worst fear?
That we'll get stuck
And then what?
and we'll die in here.
Okay.
The therapist is steady and reassuring, but it's still 15 minutes before Siddhartha can even attempt to close the door.
I'm thinking, like, I don't even know if I can do this.
Why can't you? What's holding you back?
I'm afraid. I'm so scared.
It's your fear. This is hard.
Under therapist Sandra Baker's guidance, Siddhartha experiences a full-fledged panic attack.
And I have all these anxious thoughts about what will I do when the door closes.
For Siddhartha, simply being able to ride this elevator will become an act of terror and ultimately liberation.
I'm going to take my hand off of the button and I want you to feel the anxiety. It will not hurt you. I'm taking my finger off. You're okay. You're okay. You're okay. That's just a behavior. That's anxiety. Feel it. You are fine. Look at how fine.
What are we doing? Oh my God.
Just let it come on.
Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna let go of you, Sandra.
Finally, Siddhartha breaks through her worst fear.
You're doing it. This is great. You're doing it.
Oh my God.
Okay. Now don't go out of the elevator yet. I want
Okay.
you to just stay.
Eventually, like removing the training wheels, Siddhartha has to do it on her own.
Ready? Okay. You can do this. Oh. This
Repeating the experience again and again breaks the back of her fear. And with each...
Anyway, so you can see that this is actually not an easy piece of work at all. And, that's another part of psychoeducation. When kids do this, it's very hard work and it needs to be recognized by everybody. So what one does with exposure is one creates a hierarchy with some sort of rating of how much anxiety or these subjective units of distress the child experiences, doing different things. And you as teachers will be engaged with this. This is the one part. Now, very often at the very bottom of the hierarchy, you will see something, especially for the child who hasn't been to school for a very long time, some sort of approximation or some sort of a contact with school, like perhaps having a 5-minute conversation with you, with the teacher. And the child might call and say, "Hello, Mrs. Jones. This is Thomas. How are you? How is the class pet? And I'll speak to you again next week. And thank you very much for your time." And that might be the first time that the child has any contact with a school-related activity. And that's something that might be at the very bottom of the child's hierarchy. And then here's the thing, that the child then needs to repeat this 3 more times in the next week until they don't panic when they talk to you on the phone. And then once they've mastered this level of the hierarchy, they will go up. And we'll never go down. We always go up and keep going until the child is ready to come back to school. So this is the one thing that I think as teachers, you are very helpful for therapists because we would need to have an agreement with you on what it is that's going to happen. There are a number of things that young people have in place to reduce their anxiety. Now, that's a tricky part of the treatment. Some of this may be helpful in the short term. I really repeat this, in the short term, because eventually we want the child to be able to go to school without any of these safety or extra behaviors, if possible. And the routine here is not only about school. The routine here is also about what happens at home as well. So when we start treatment, the young person then starts following what looks like a school day, but at home. No computers, no games, no pizza deliveries, nothing of that kind. The routine at home is exactly the same as at school. That's a really important part of this. And again, teachers might be involved in getting the right materials for the child to work. And remember, eventually we want to get away from all of these safety behaviors. Now, there are a number of things, though, that may be helpful for young people. And I will just show you 3 of them, especially when they experience a lot of anxiety, too much anxiety for them to stay. One of them is called grounding.
Anxious thoughts tend to be about the past or the future. And grounding is something that you can use using your 5 senses to bring you back to the here and now. You can use the strategy 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 to focus in on 5 things you can see around you, 4 things you can hear around you, 3 things you can feel around you, 2 things you can smell around you, and 1 thing that you can taste around you.
That's one thing, super easy, but could help a lot of kids who cannot stand the anxiety.
And
second one is the worry time.
one other way to reduce worry and anxiety can be to set aside what's called a worry time. This is where you set aside 15 to 30 minutes a day in a comfortable and quiet space, not too close to bedtime, to sit down and have a think about your worries. Perhaps to focus on how they make you feel, maybe to think about some solutions to them. When worries arise outside of your worry time, it's helpful to postpone them to the worry time. It might be helpful to write them down so that you don't forget them, and then focus in on the here and now in the present moment. You might find that when you come to your worry time, those worries that you wrote down feel like less of an issue.
That's something that definitely works with quite a few kids. And then the final one I wanted to show is this muscle relaxation.
When we feel anxious, we tend to experience a lot of tension in our bodies. One way to reduce that tension is to deliberately tension and then relax all of the different muscle groups in the body. You can do this by sitting comfortably or lying down. You might want to start by tensioning your hands, squeezing them for 10 seconds and then relaxing them, letting them drop and feel heavy by your side. Then you can tension your arms for 10 seconds and then relax for 10 seconds. You can move around the body, using your body as a map that you carry with you everywhere you go. And then at the very end, once you've tensioned for 10 seconds and then relaxed those different muscle groups, you can tension them all together at the same time for 10 seconds and then relax them all at the same time. This can be really helpful as a strategy for relaxing the whole body, and you can do it anywhere you go. It can even be a really helpful strategy for helping you to fall asleep at night.
And then finally, what I wanted to show you is, you remember the little boy in North Tanzania that I started with? Let's see what happens to him around here. See, he's still there on his own, but frozen. He's a little bit smiling now. And basically, kids just grab him. Other kids, they just grab his hand.
Oh, they took him now.
And then they play. You see?
Okay.
All the girls organize everybody else. Which really takes me to another important part to this, with that the sense of community and the community support from other kids and from other people is really one of the key things that will help us overcome this problem. So that's it. I just wanted to leave you with my clinical teams and students and scouts as well. And there are some further resources here for you to have a look at. And now I hope we can have a few minutes for questions and answers, and then we'll hand you over to Francois.